A woman was killed on an empty train car with no one else going in or out. A mysterious, deadly illness that defies diagnosis. A missing man was found at the top of a 10-foot pile of coal. In each case, someone died, but the exact circumstances of their death defy explanation. Was it an assassin, alien abduction? No one can say for sure, but many have certainly tried. Today we're taking a look at some of the most bizarre, compelling, mysterious deaths that we just can't explain. Alexander the Great, Alexander III of Macedon, also known as Alexander the Great, conquered lands from Macedonia to Egypt, Greece, and parts of India. But he couldn't conquer whatever mysterious health condition killed him at the age of 32. After returning to Babylon from an unsuccessful campaign in India, Alexander was not feeling so great. After a night of drinking, he came down with a fever that grew worse and worse as the days wore on. Eventually, all he could do was lie in bed. 10 days after the fever first came on, he was dead. Other accounts report a sudden sharp pain in his abdomen, and most accounts agree that Alexander's body did not show any signs of decay for 6 days after his death. To witnesses at the time, this was evidence that Alexander was more than a mere man, and he possessed some godlike powers. Today, his death is the source of spirited debate among medical professionals and historians. At the time of his death, no one suspected that Alexander was poisoned. However, he had accumulated plenty of enemies during his lifetime, any of whom might have had good reason to poison him. Graham Phillips suggested in the book Alexander the Great, Murder in Babylon, that it could be strychnine poison. However, this poison does not cause a fever and causes convulsions, which were not described in any accounts of Alexander's death. Leo Shep suggested hellebore, which could have been mixed with wine. Some historians have suggested necrotizing pancreatitis, while others have brought up the possibility of West Nile virus or malaria, which he could have picked up on his travels. There is one other potential explanation that has gained traction in recent years, one that would be especially troubling. Dr. Catherine Hall, a senior lecturer at the Dunedin School of Medicine at the University of Otago, New Zealand, proposed that the paralysis described during his illness is indicative of Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological disorder. She additionally raised the possibility that, as the paralysis progressed, his breathing became less apparent. This led to his doctors declaring him dead when, according to her theory, he was still alive. She believes that he may have been alive during those 6 days during which he did not show any signs of decay. His death may be the most famous case of pseudothanatos, or false diagnosis of death, ever recorded. Natalie Wood, Hollywood is filled with mysteries that rival those seen on the silver screen. One of the most enduring Hollywood mysteries is the death of the beloved actress Natalie Wood. On November 29, 1981, the 43-year-old Natalie Wood was found floating face down in the ocean off the coast of Catalina Island. At the time, the death was ruled accidental, attributed to a combination of drinking and her inability to swim. However, in 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation after years of speculation that her death could have been the result of a homicide. In 2013, her cause of death was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Some of the details that muddied the waters of her death included bruises on her arms and knees, as well as a scratch on her neck, indicating she might have been attacked before she drowned. It was also difficult to get a clear picture of the events of November 28, 1981, with conflicting statements regarding whether she had argued with her husband, Robert Wagner, on the yacht where she was last seen before disappearing. Some detectives have suggested that Wagner knew more about the incident than he let on while talking to authorities, but his attorney has vehemently denied this. Despite the new concerns raised by the reopened investigation and a great deal of pressure from true crime enthusiasts, the department was not able to determine whether Natalie Wood's death was indeed the result of a crime or just a tragic accident. Zygmunt Adamski. In June 1980, a 56-year-old miner named Zygmunt Adamski vanished from his home in Tingley, West Yorkshire. 5 days later, Adamski's body was found at a coal yard in Tudmorden, 5 miles from his home. The body was on top of a 10-foot-high pile of coal, and he was wearing a suit, but his shirt, watch, and wallet were missing. His hair had been cut short. But the most unusual thing about Zygmunt Adamski's body was that it was covered in burn marks on the head, neck, and shoulders. The burns were covered in some sort of ointment, but their exact nature could not be identified. Alan Godfrey, the police officer who arrived on the scene, said that Adamski's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Those eyes were staring up at me. I was looking down on him from a foot away. Those eyes sent a shudder down my spine. They were wide open. He had the look of someone who had seen something or someone that had scared him to death. According to BBC Inside Out, James Turnbull, the coroner who examined Adamski's body, considers it to be the biggest mystery of his career. One of the most bizarre aspects of the body, aside from its location and the burns, was the fact that Adamski had only 1 day's worth of beard growth despite having been missing for 5 days. The case was filled with unanswered questions and riddles that would never be solved. Where was he when he was missing? What killed him? How did he get on top of this coal pile? Some blamed Adamski's family, others pointed their fingers at the KGB. There were even those who attributed the disappearance and death to an alien abduction. Whether Adamski was taken by foreign intelligence, an ordinary enemy, or something altogether inhuman, we will likely never know exactly what happened. Dr. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler. In the early hours of the morning on New Year's Day in 1963, 2 boys walking near the Lane Cove River in Sydney, Australia, spotted a man lying face down on the ground. At first glance, they thought he was just another partygoer from the night before who had a bit too much to drink and passed out. But when they walked by the area again an hour and a half later, they saw that his face had turned purple. They called the police, who arrived on the scene to find the man naked from the waist down with his suit trousers placed over his lower half and covered by a carpet. His name was Dr. Gilbert Bogle, and he was dead. 10 meters away, on the riverbank, they found another half-naked body, this one belonging to a woman named Margaret Chandler. Both pairs of underwear were found nearby. Margaret and Dr. Bogle had clearly come here together. This was rather scandalous, as the two were married and not to each other. The authorities had never seen anything like this. A couple sneaking off to the lover's lane by the river, getting halfway undressed, and then being interrupted by something that left them both dead. Neither of them was injured, and nothing unusual turned up during the autopsy. No distinct cause of death could be determined, leaving the authorities with their best guess. Suspicion first fell on Jeffrey, Margaret's husband, but not only did they turn out to have an open marriage, but he was with his own girlfriend all night. The presence of vomit and excrement near the bodies suggested poison might have played a part, and the burden of finding some evidence fell on the toxicologist. But they could not determine anything other than one fact. Whatever killed one killed the other, and at the same time. The 2006 documentary, Who Killed Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler, suggested another possibility: asphyxiation from hydrogen sulfide in the river. This toxic gas, which was emanating from the mud due to the dumping of waste in the area, was identified by a Maritime Services Board called to investigate the pollution. The gas is heavier than air and would have been more present at ground level. If someone was lying in it, they could asphyxiate and die without realizing what was happening. Still, that is just one theory of many, and the precise cause of Bogle and Chandler's deaths may never be uncovered. Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart is one of the most famous pilots and women in history. She is remembered for her aviation records and for being the first female pilot to fly alone across the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, that's not all that she's famous for. On June 1st, 1937, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, left Oakland, California for their transcontinental flight. While flying over the Pacific Ocean, Earhart and Noonan's plane disappeared. No one could locate any trace of them or their plane, and Earhart was declared dead on January 5th, 1939. No definitive conclusions about Earhart's fate have ever been reached, but of course, there have been plenty of theories, some more realistic than others. One theory posits that Earhart was a spy for the U.S. government and was taken prisoner by Japanese forces while trying to collect intelligence. Another more widely accepted theory is that Earhart and Noonan reached the island of Nikumaroro and died there. A heel from a woman's shoe, an aluminum panel, and a piece of curved glass have all been found on the island. These might have belonged to Earhart and her plane, but we may never know for sure. Charles Francis Hall. In 1870, Charles Francis Hall led an expedition to the North Pole. The team received $50,000 from Congress, and their ship, Polaris, left Connecticut on July 3, 1871. As the ship continued north, tensions brewed among the crew, particularly between Hall and the sailing master Sidney Boodington, as well as doctor and natural scientist Emil Bessels. In October, Polaris came to a stop. In November, after a 2-week scouting expedition, Hall returned to the ship and drank a cup of coffee. He quickly became ill and accused the other officers of poisoning him. On November 8th, he was dead, buried in a shallow grave. The remaining crew would never reach the North Pole as Captain Boodington had run Polaris aground. After the crew members returned to New York, the Navy Board of Inquiry investigated Hall's death and determined that he had died of an apoplectic seizure. But in 1968, Chauncey C. Loomis, who was writing a biography of Hall at the time, traveled to his grave. There, he was able to take samples of hair and fingernails and have them tested. The tests showed an intake of considerable amounts of arsenic by C.F. Hall in the last 2 weeks of his life. Loomis wrote that if Hall was murdered, Emil Bessels is the prime subject. However, arsenic was also found in many medicines during that time period, and it is entirely possible that if Hall was poisoned, he unknowingly did it to himself. In both cases, those ifs are doing a lot of heavy lifting. Dyatlov Pass hikers. On January 23, 1959, 10 hikers led by Igor Dyatlov trudged into the Ural Mountains in Russia. One of them had to turn back after a medical emergency, but the remaining 9 continued, planning to send word back after 3 weeks. On February 20th, no one had heard from the group, and a search party was sent to look for them. When the search party finally tracked down the missing hikers, they found a gruesome scene. 5 of the hikers' bodies were spread out across the snow in various states of undress. One was missing part of his own knuckle, which appeared to have been bitten off, perhaps self-inflicted. After the snow melted, the final 4 bodies were found. Their injuries were equally bizarre. One of the hikers had a twisted neck, 1 had a fractured skull, 2 were missing their eyes, and 1 was missing her tongue. It was clear at first glance that they had died from hypothermia, and the snow that had collapsed their tent was from some sort of compelling natural force, but the plot soon thickened. Some of the hikers' clothing contained traces of radiation, leading some to speculate that weapons testing had been involved in the disaster that killed them. Other theories have included the CIA, the FBI, Yeti, aliens, and the most plausible theory, a slab avalanche that fell on the tent. However, slab avalanches usually occur at steeper inclines than the one in the Dyatlov Pass. So even though the slab avalanche theory is a compelling possibility, the case is far from closed. Fans of the murder mystery genre might be familiar with the trope of the locked room murder, which, as the name implies, occurs in a locked room with no apparent way for the killer to get in or out. It's ordinarily the stuff of fiction, but in 1937, the Paris Metro's first-class car saw a locked room murder that was all too real. Laetitia Toureau was a 29-year-old Italian immigrant who had lived in Paris for over a decade. She was a widow who had once been married to a high-society man, Jules. Jules kept her a secret during their 6-year marriage, and his parents only learned of her existence after his death. Laetitia had secrets of her own, too. She was a double agent, working for the Paris police to infiltrate La Cagoule, a fascist terrorist group. Before her death, the Cagoule began to suspect Laetitia was a mole. On her last night alive, Laetitia boarded the Paris Metro for the ride home, sitting alone in a first-class car at the Porte de Charenton station. The next stop, Porte Doré, was 45 seconds away. By the time the train reached that stop, Laetitia Toureau was on death's door. She was on the floor with a 9-inch knife in her neck and died on the way to the hospital. According to the tram driver, she was the only one in the metro car. It is possible that the Cagoule sent Jean Filiol, one of their assassins, after her. But if that was the case, how did he get into the train car without being seen, stab her in the neck, and escape, all in only 45 seconds? It's like something out of an Agatha Christie novel, but without Hercule Poirot arriving to provide a neat explanation before the final page. Elisa Lam. Few modern unsolved deaths have drawn as much wild speculation as the tragic disappearance of Elisa Lam. On January 31st, 2013, the 21-year-old Elisa Lam vanished from the infamous Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. When her parents didn't hear from her, they contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. No one could find any trace of Elisa until they checked the security footage. The video showed Elisa acting strangely in one of the hotel's elevators. She stepped into the elevator and pushed all of the buttons, then began to step in and out of the elevator, peeking out into the hallway. In the final part of the footage, she could be seen standing near the left side of the door, gesticulating wildly and appearing to have an intense conversation with someone who was not in the frame. 2 weeks after the video was published, hotel guests began to complain about low water pressure and a strange, unpleasant taste in the tap water. A maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez investigated the source of the problem and found Elisa's body floating in a hotel water tank. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning, but many questions were left unanswered. How did she get into the tank in the first place? Was she alone? The autopsy did not show any signs of foul play, and it is highly possible that Elisa was suffering from a mental health crisis. But it would have taken a great deal of effort for her to wind up in a water tank if the drowning was self-inflicted. To reach the tank she was found in, Lopez had to take the elevator to the 15th floor and walk up a staircase to the roof. He had to turn off the rooftop alarm and climb onto a platform where the water tanks were kept. Next, he had to climb another ladder to reach the top of the main tank. It would have been difficult for Elisa to reach this location without setting off an alarm or drawing any attention to herself. Elisa Lam's death is far from the only dark mystery attached to the Cecil Hotel. The building has seen more than its fair share of deaths and supposed hauntings, as well as serial killers such as Richard Ramirez. The story of Elisa Lam is one of many horrors seen by the Cecil Hotel that will likely never be explained. The South Pole poisoning. In May of 2000, a 32-year-old astrophysicist named Rodney Marks was walking from a research building to the main base of the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station when he suddenly began to have difficulty breathing. His vision began to blur, and he felt a rush of intense fatigue. He went to bed, hoping a good night's sleep would help. But at 5:30 a.m., he woke up vomiting blood. Throughout the day, his symptoms only worsened. His joints ached, his eyes were incredibly sensitive to light, and he became increasingly distressed to the point of hyperventilation.